Ronald Thiemann is the Benjamin Busey Professor of Theology at Harvard University and will lead us to consider Luther's theology of the cross.
I apologize in advance for the raspiness of my voice. If you have difficulty hearing me, please do let me know. Martin Luther is one of those figures in the history of Christianity who has been invoked to support every imaginable theological, cultural, and political point of view. Luther has often functioned as a blank screen onto which scholars, politicians, and polemicists have projected their own hopes, fears, illusions, and fantasies. The uses and abuses of Luther's legacy in the German Nazi and communist regimes are well known, and the late Robert Scribner has documented the myth-making function of Luther images in post-Reformation Germany in his delightful article, Incombustible Luther, the image of the reformer in early modern Germany. Luther seems to be a well-nigh inexhaustible resource for polemic, propaganda, and even phantasmagoria.
Sir, your voice is too loud with the microphone.
Okay, so maybe they in the back can... Thanks. Let me know again. Okay, to propose that Luther's theology of the cross can serve as a resource for a Christian theology of religions might seem just another illusory projection by a Lutheran theologian desperate to invoke the reformer's authority over his own theological proposals. How might this equal opportunity excoriator, known for his condemnations of Jew, Turk, Catholic, Pope, peasant, and pagan alike, serve as a model for our contemporary efforts to engage the challenge of religious diversity and religious conflict? And how might his highly particular Christocentric theology of the cross be a theological resource for interreligious understanding and dialogue? Such a proposal may seem on the face of it counterintuitive and unpersuasive, but I intend to make just such a case this morning. Before I propose Luther's Theologia Crucis as a model for a theology of religions, I need to sketch out my understanding of the conceptual shape of this fundamental theologumenon. Following many Luther interpreters, I understand Theologia Crucis not just as one evangelical doctrine among others, but as the chief hermeneutical key to Luther's theological orientation. Theologia Crucis identifies not just Luther's basic theological insight into the gospel, but also describes the fundamental spiritual orientation or sensibility of the evangelical theologian. It is no accident that in the Heidelberg disputation, 1518, Luther emphasizes not simply the theology of the cross, but more importantly, the stance of the theologian of the cross. Luther is simultaneously describing an intellectual approach to the theological task and an existential commitment to an evangelical spiritual practice. Theologia Crucis on this interpretation is a complex set of intellectual and spiritual practices designed to shape the mind, character, and faith of the theologian. Theologia Crucis invites the theologian into an evangelical form of life that will continually shape and reshape the believer's orientation toward Christian thought and practice. Theologia Crucis is thus an invitation to theology as a way of life. It thus reaffirms Luther's conviction that living, or rather dying and being damned, make a theologian, not understanding, reading, or speculating. Crux sola est nostra theologia. The locus classicus for Luther's theology of the cross is the Heidelberg disputation, over which Luther presided on April 26, 1518, for the chapter of the Augustinian order meeting at Heidelberg. Luther drew up a series of theological and philosophical theses at the invitation of Johannes von Staupitz, and in so doing sketched out the shape of a theology that would sustain him throughout his life. The first two sets of theses deal respectively with the problem of good works and the will. In the theses on good works, Luther drives home the point that good works, though they appear attractive and comely, are in fact mortal sins. Contrariwise, God's works, which often appear unattractive and even evil, are in fact the sole source of our eternal merit and life. As God drives us to the recognition that, quote, there is no form or beauty in us, but our life is hidden in God, God accomplishes his opus proprium through its apparent opposite, his opus alienum. Thus, there is nothing within human beings that can in any way merit the righteous and saving love of God. Our salvation is accomplished solely through the hidden works of God accomplished in our behalf. In like manner, Luther asserts that the human will is unable to accomplish anything that would make us righteous before God. Quote, the person who believes that he can obtain grace by doing what is in him, quod in se est, adds sin to sin, so that he becomes doubly guilty. Our utter inability to achieve righteousness before God should not, Luther stresses, give cause for despair, but rather should arouse, quote, the desire to humble oneself and seek the grace of God. But even this self-humbling and seeking is not a meritorious human act. The transformation of our wills is itself always and only a work of God. Quote, it is certain that man must utterly despair of his own ability before he is prepared to receive the grace of Christ. Thus it becomes clear in these early theses that Luther is laying out a set of normative proposals for living a life shaped by the gospel of Jesus Christ. While there are important epistemological consequences of living such a life, the existential and spiritual dimensions of the theology of the cross are front and center from the outset. Thus it comes as no surprise in the next set of theses that Luther turns not to the abstract question of a theology of the cross, but to the concrete issue of the form of life exemplified by the theologian of the cross. That person does not deserve to be called a theologian who looks upon the invisible things of God as though they were clearly perceptible in those things that have actually happened. He deserves to be called a theologian, however, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God, posteriori Dei, seen through suffering and the cross. A theologian of glory calls good good and good evil. A theologian of the cross calls the thing what it actually is. These three theses describe a set of theological practices that characterize the work of one whose life has been shaped by the saving grace of God in Christ. As one saved solely through the gracious action of the crucified God, the theologian deserving of that name adopts those theological practices appropriate to the cruciform nature of God's saving acts. Together, these theses sketch out a program of epistemological realism, an approach to theology that discourages metaphysical speculation and encourages a sober, descriptive realism. The goal of theological reflection is not to hypothesize about the invisible attributes of an unknown, transcendent God, but to describe the visible and manifest works of a God become flesh, thereby hidden in suffering and the cross. God's reality is not to be found in an invisible realm beyond the human senses, but in the visible evidence of the suffering and crucified Christ. The God upon whom the theologian ought to reflect is not the invisible God perceived through metaphysical speculation, but a God who shows the theologian his backside, posteriori Dei, in suffering and the cross. The revealed God is the God who is hidden in the cross of Christ. God's reality is thereby revealed precisely in its hiddenness, under the form of its opposite, abscondita sub contrariis. As Luther remarked in a sermon delivered in February 1517, man hides his own things in order to conceal them, God hides his own things in order to reveal them. The God who is revealed through the hiddenness of the cross can be known only through faith. Faith alone receives the righteousness of God in Christ, and faith alone opens the eyes of the believer to see the true God hidden in suffering. The theologian of glory expects God to be manifest in power, majesty, and strength, but the theologian of the cross knows through the eyes of faith that God is in fact manifest in suffering, death, and a cross. Because God's true nature is always and only revealed under God's opposite, faith cannot rely upon the evidences of reason, nature, or experience for its certitude. Luther was particularly fond of the definition of faith found in the book of Hebrews. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Such a faith is inevitably plagued by doubt and assaulted by uncertainties, Anfechtungen. Faith itself undergoes the crucible of suffering and death, as the believer theologian seeks to follow the suffering and crucified God. Faith thus shares in the sufferings of the crucified one as the believer struggles to follow in faithful discipleship. Because faith itself undergoes such a crisis of confidence, Luther insists that faith's doubts can be assuaged only through the saving work of God in Christ. No amount of contemplation of one's own faith or subjectivity can ever convince the believer that the God revealed in the cross is the God who makes the sinner righteous. That confidence flows only from the believer's contemplation of the cross of Christ, the act whereby Christ becomes sin so that sinners might become righteous. This theme of the blessed exchange receives its most magnificent expression in Luther's greater Galatians commentary, but it is present in Luther's earlier thought as well. Already in his Operationes in Salmos 15:19-21, Luther asserts that Christ became sin for us in order that righteousness might become ours as well. Luther's penchant for realist discourse comes to the fore again as he claims that Christ becomes the greatest sinner, maximus peccator, so that sinners might become the righteous ones of God. And here in this language about the blessed exchange, you also see the joyous Luther, not just the melancholy Luther, not just in his hymns, but wherever he reflects on the power of the blessed exchange. I have a long passage from the greater Galatians commentary. I'll just read the first two lines. This is the most joyous of all doctrines and the one that contains the most comfort. It teaches that we have the indescribable and inestimable mercy and love of God. The theologian of the cross thus lives by faith and not by sight. Moreover, such a theologian lives out of the humility and gratitude of one who recognizes that salvation, knowledge of God, and true theology are all gifts of the unmerited yet free love and mercy of God. The theologian of the cross thus lives a life of humilitas fidei, a faith born of both humility and confidence, of gratitude and grace. Having seen God's proper work emerge out of God's alien work, the theologian of the cross refuses to avert her eyes from the suffering of the world, knowing that such suffering has been borne and reconciled in the cross of Christ. The theologian of the cross is willing to call things what they really are, knowing that no sin or death is so great that it cannot be redeemed by the crucified. The theologian of the cross engages in a theology of cruciform and realistic hope, always expecting the unexpected from a God whose revelation is hidden within its apparent opposite. The theologian of the cross is thus realistic yet hopeful, doubting yet faithful, humble yet confident, trusting that the grace and mercy of God will enable theological work to discern the visible and manifest things of God through suffering and the cross. Theologia Crucis and a cruciform theology of religions. One of the greatest needs in today's world is for Christians to develop theological approaches to the engagement with the world's religious traditions, an engagement which holds fast to the deepest convictions of the Christian faith and is yet open to other traditions' own witness to truth. The challenge is to find a way between forms of absolutism and exclusivism, which deny a priori the validity claims of other religions, and forms of relativism which undermine the truth claims of all religions in the name of tolerance and mutual understanding. Fundamentalisms of various stripe assert the truth of their own religious claims to the exclusion of all other claims to truth. And some forms of liberalism eschew truth-claiming altogether in order to foster a peaceful rapprochement between the world's religious faith. But both approaches are, in my judgment, corrosive of the integrity of a faith which is at once confident yet modest, faithful yet questing. So in the second part of my remarks, I want to argue that a religious sensibility shaped by the virtues of Luther's theology of the cross provides important resources for developing a theology of religions that is both robustly truth-claiming yet genuinely open to the faith claims of others. A theology of the cross can assist communities of faith in recognizing compatibility between deep and abiding commitment to the truth claims of one's own tradition and an openness to and a respect for the claims of another tradition. Truth and acceptance of truth claiming and acceptance of religious pluralism are not inconsistent, or so I hope to argue in the remainder of my remarks. In the full essay, then, this next section is a fairly technical analysis of the problems of exclusivism, absolutism, and relativism, and I'm going to briefly summarize what I do there and then move to the concluding section. In this next section of the paper, I argue that a necessary prolegomenon to any Christian theology of religions is an understanding of Christian truth-claiming that finds a middle way between exclusivism in truth, absolutism in knowledge, and a truth-eroding relativism on the other hand. The argument of the rest of the paper is that there is a convergence between a non-foundational, pragmatist, but non-relativist philosophy and a theology and spiritual sensibility shaped by Theologia Crucis. Time does not allow me to trace the philosophical argument, so I will move to the theological one. At stake here is the question of whether there is compatibility between deep and abiding commitment to the truth claims of one's tradition and an openness to and respect for the claims of another tradition. In the remainder of my remarks, I want to argue that truth claiming and an acceptance of religious pluralism are not inconsistent. Fundamental to the acceptance of pluralism is the conviction that we have no self-evident, incorrigible means of establishing the truth of our propositions. It does not follow, however, that we have no way at all to establish the truth of our assertions, though it does follow that the means at our disposal will not necessarily convince those with whom we disagree. Consequently, we must hold open the possibility that those who disagree with us do so rationally. This position implies neither relativism nor indifferentism to truth. It simply suggests that we cannot coerce others into believing as we do. We can offer our reasons for so believing, but those reasons, even if sufficient to support our claims, will not compel others to accept our beliefs. I believe that the appropriate goal of a Christian theology of religions is to understand those religions in and for themselves and to give an account of the grounds within Christian theology itself for being open to the witness of truth that might come from careful listening to those religions. Careful listening, done in a respectful manner, requires a genuine openness to the claims of other religions, an openness that does not prejudge whether those claims confirm, conflict with, or simply differ from the Christian witness. Genuine respect for the religious other requires Christians to hold open the manifold possibilities, the manifold possibilities that might emerge from genuine interreligious dialogue and mutual examination. Generalizations about the truth of all religions seem no more plausible than generalizations about the falsity of all religions. Genuine respect for the religious other requires, in my estimation, holding open the possibility that claims of the religious other might be true, false, relevant, irrelevant, wise, or foolish. Empty generalizations about the necessary truth within the other is no more respectful, though perhaps considerably less dangerous, than empty generalizations about the falsity of the religious other. Christian theology should eschew all attempts either to assert the necessary superiority of the Christian faith or the necessary equality of other religions' claims to truth. Rather, Christian theology should simply give the grounds within the Christian faith for a respectful hearing of the other that might alert us to claims of truth should we encounter them in the witness of other religions. I believe that the grounds for just such an openness are found in the intellectual and spiritual practices of Theologia Crucis, and it is to that claim that I turn by way of conclusion. He deserves to be called a theologian, writes Luther, who comprehends the visible and manifest things of God seen through suffering and the cross. The back and visible things of God are placed in opposition to the invisible, namely his human nature, weakness, and foolishness. Nor is it sufficient for anyone, and it does him no good, to recognize God in his glory and majesty unless he recognizes him in the humility and shame of the cross. For this reason, true theology and recognition of God are in the crucified Christ. He who does not know Christ does not know God hidden in suffering. God can be found only in suffering and the cross. Christian doctrines of God have traditionally asserted a dialectical relationship between the apophatic and cataphatic aspects of God's revelation. While some theologians stress more the mystery at the heart of God, and others emphasize the genuine availability of God's reality to human knowing, all such doctrines claim a complex relation between God's hiddenness and revelation. Even Karl Barth, the great Protestant theologian of revelation, emphasizes God's inescapable hiddenness. As one who stands in the tradition of theologians of the cross, Barth claims simultaneously that God has bound God's self eternally in Jesus Christ and is thereby available to be known by us, and that God remains sovereign Lord always and everywhere in control of God's own self-revelation. For finally, God's self-revelation is nothing more or less than the presence of God among us, Emmanuel, the divine in human flesh. But the encounter with God's revelation is always itself an event, an act in which God remains solely in control of God's own self-disclosure. Thus, while we do have confidence that God is truly present for us in Jesus Christ, we must recognize that God's presence always exceeds any ability we might have for knowing or grasping it. God's mystery is every bit as much a part of God's self-giving in Jesus Christ as is God's self-revelation. Consequently, a genuine modesty about what we claim to know must be yoked to an appropriate confidence that we do nonetheless genuinely know God in the person of Jesus Christ. Barth is characteristically better at asserting the confidence than he is the modesty, but both are an essential part of his doctrine of God. Nonetheless, one can work within the context of a doctrine of God like Barth's and have ample grounds for asserting the continuing majesty of God's self-giving, a majesty that relies always and only upon God's self-determination and never upon our feeble attempt to understand. The scope and availability of God's self-revelation is limited only by the scope of God's own unconstrained self-determination. But finally, there are other, more central Christological grounds for asserting Christian openness to the witness of truth within other religions. At the heart of the gospel narratives is a controversy concerning the identity of Jesus Christ. In the synoptic gospels, Jesus is regularly misidentified by those who are closest to him. I have shown in previous work how the Gospel of Matthew is structured around the distinction between disciples, mathetes, and those who follow, akoluthein and its variations. The disciples are often those who are physically in proximity to Jesus, but most often misunderstand his words and actions. An epithet Jesus uses of the disciples on a number of occasions in the narrative is those of little faith. The ones who most often recognize Jesus' true identity are apparently minor characters in the stories: a leper, the Roman centurion, the Gadarene demoniacs, a paralytic, a hemorrhaging woman, 2 blind men, a Canaanite woman, and the centurion at the foot of the cross. Within the Passion narrative itself, the only true followers, the ones who recognize that Jesus' ministry and mission must lead to crucifixion, are Joseph of Arimathea and, most importantly, Jesus' women followers. So the Gospels themselves witness to the fact that Jesus' own identity is most likely to be recognized by those who live on the boundaries, beyond the pale, and on the margins. These stories give no support to those who would assert that insiders have a unique and incorrigible grasp of the gospel's truth. On the contrary, it is those who are apparent outsiders who recognize Jesus' identity and thereby witness to its truth. Mutatis mutandis, we should hardly be surprised if in our own times authentic witness to the truth comes not from those who are apparent insiders within Christianity, but precisely from those religious others who too often have been consigned a place beyond the pale of truth, but may in fact be carriers of it. It is finally the fundamental drama at the heart of the Christian story that gives the strongest warrant for Christian openness to the witness of truth of other religious traditions. Christianity's basic claim is that the truth about God and the world is to be found in the story of the execution of a political prisoner at the hands of the Roman. This itinerant preacher, now become the crucified victim of the state, is nonetheless declared by Christians to reveal the loving being of God. Moreover, Christians further assert that this crucified man now lives through the resurrecting power of God, that the one who died by crucifixion now lives as exalted Lord of the universe. In its more radical Christological traditions, like Theologia Crucis, Christianity claims that in the death of Jesus Christ, God engaged in a remarkable exchange, that in Jesus' death, God became a curse for us in order that we might become righteous like God. And further, that through this extraordinary act of exchange, God takes on our fate, the destiny of death, and transforms it into life everlasting in God's own presence. Now, if there were ever a religion founded upon a series of counterintuitive, even paradoxical claims, it is surely Christianity. No simple act of reason can possibly incline Christian believers to commit themselves to the belief that Jesus, the crucified, now lives, and that we too will live in him. Such a commitment entails an act of faith that contradicts ordinary experience concerning the finality of death. That is why Christians confess with Luther and the book of Hebrews that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That is why Christians confess with St. Paul that now we see through a glass darkly and cannot know with absolute certainty that the path of discipleship leads to its promised end. Still, believers follow on in hope, awaiting the day when they may see face to face. But for now, Christians have only faith, the demands of discipleship, and the beckoning presence of one who bids us come and follow. And for some, that is enough. Such following in faith, hope, and love should instill an attitude of modesty, humility, and gratitude. Far from grasping the truth and extolling the sufficiency and finality of the Christian revelation, followers of the cross recognize that God always reveals God's self sub contrario, under God's opposite. Faith in the Christian gospel yields a Theologia Crucis, a theology of the cross that seeks the truth of God's revelation wherever the loving, self-determining God seeks to make God's self known. The path of Christian discipleship is one of hopeful following, and the life of Christian discipleship is one of loving commitment to the neighbor in need. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and love ought thus to quicken Christians' awareness of the manifold sources of God's glorious and gracious self-revelation. And knowing God as we do in Jesus Christ, Christians should be the first to acknowledge that God's self-revelation appears in some surprising places indeed. Not only does the Christian gospel make no a priori denial of the possibility of God's self-revelation to other persons in different times and places, it alerts Christians to the ever-present possibility that God's revelation is likely to appear where we least expect it. But in order to recognize such moments, we must engage in careful and modest listening to the religious other, neither consigning the other to eternal perdition, nor claiming without careful examination that the other has found the way or the truth. Listening carefully and making modest, careful, and thoughtful judgments about truth and falsity is the best way to be faithful to the Christian gospel and to respect the freedom and integrity of the religious other. Thus, following the spiritual practices of the theology of the cross might allow a genuine Christian theology of religions to emerge. And for that, we might have to offer, at the very least, a tip of the Beretta to Martin Luther. Thank you.